What happens in the market when the government imposes a tax on the purchase or sale of a good or service? Let's find out and dive into today's topic: government intervention, specific taxes, or excise taxes. I'm Mr. Racine. Welcome to today's episode of
Economics videos that don't suck.
Legal disclaimer. Really quick while I have you here, after you're done watching this video, be sure to check out www.evtds.com to access our entire video catalog, as well as practice questions and more! In every economy, governments have the option of collecting taxes as a means to collect revenue. Direct taxes are taxes on earnings. These include things like income tax or corporate earnings tax. Indirect taxes, on the other hand, are taxes on transactions. Examples of indirect taxes include sales taxes, value-added taxes, or taxes on imports, tariffs. Today, we're going to be looking at the impact of an indirect tax on the market. To begin with, let's consider a simple tax on suppliers. This is Sig, captain of the Northwestern, an Alaskan king crab fisherman. King crab farming is a dangerous profession. One might go so far as to say, the deadliest. Every morning, Sig wakes up and checks the market price of Alaskan king crab, the price that he can get for selling 1 pound of that sweet 8-legged Alaskan gold. If he wakes up and he sees that the price is $30, Sig can't even cover the cost of fuel needed to go out and go fishing, so it's not worth his time. He'll just turn around and go back to sleep, and he'll supply 0 pounds of king crab to the market. If, however, he wakes up and he finds out the price is $40, well, that's going to be worth his time. He'll wake up, get out of bed, go down to the marina, he'll go out, he'll fish the close waters, and he'll bring in, let's say, 100 pounds of king crab in one day. If the price is $50, well, that's even better. It might even be worth his while to, hire some help. He'll go out a little bit further and bring back 200 pounds of king crab in one day. At a price of $60 per pound, now it's really worth it. He'll hire a bigger crew, he'll go out even further, and he'll bring back, let's say, 300 pounds of king crab. Okay, so we have our usual supply curve here with the prices that Sig can get for selling king crab and the quantity that he'll supply at those different prices. Now, let's introduce a specific tax. Assume that the government at Dutch Harbor decides that they want to impose a tax to increase government revenue. Let's say that they want to charge $10 per pound of king crab that is fished. This means that for every pound of crab that Sig brings back and sells, he needs to pay $10 to the government. Let's consider how this should impact Sig's supply curve. Okay, now with a tax imposed, if Sig wakes up and he finds that the price is $30, he's definitely not going to get out of bed. If it wasn't worth his time when he was only getting paid $30 per pound fished, then it's definitely not going to be worth his time if he gets paid $30 and he has to pay someone else $10. So at a price of $30, quantity supplied is still going to be zero. Okay, what if Sig wakes up and now the price is $40? Previously, Sig would have supplied 100 pounds of crab at a price of $40 because it was enough for him to make some money and he would go out fishing. But now, with a $10 tax imposed, Sig wakes up and thinks to himself, all right, I'm going to get $40 from the market, but I still need to turn over $10 to the government for every pound that I fish and sell. So in reality, Sig is only getting $30 per pound. And we know at a price of $30 per pound, he definitely wasn't going to fish at all. So when the market price is $40, Sig is still going to supply 0 pounds of crab. If Sig wakes up and the market price is $50, he does a little bit of groggy calculation in his head and he realizes that at a market price of $50, after paying the tax to the government, he still gets $40. And $40 is worth his time. It's worth it for him to go into shallow waters and to fish 100 pounds of crab. He's not going to hire any crew, but it's worth it. So if the market price is $50, Sig will supply 100 pounds of crab. Similarly, if the market price is $60, Sig gets $50 after paying the taxes, so he's going to be willing to supply 200 pounds of crab because to him, it's like getting $50 per pound. And finally, the price would need to go all the way up to $70 per pound in order for Sig to be willing to hire a bigger crew, go out further, and supply 300 pounds of crab. Okay, so this is Sig's supply curve after the tax has been implemented. Let's take a look at what's happened. Effectively, we can say that supply definitely has decreased because it shifted to the left, and we know that a shift to the left of the supply curve signifies a decrease in supply. But in this one case, it may be more useful to realize that when we implement a specific tax on a good, it shifts the supply curve upwards by the amount of the tax imposed on that good or service. So in this case, we see that SIG's supply curve has shifted upwards by $10, the amount that the government is taxing him. And again, what does this mean? It just means that SIG now needs to get from the market $10 more in order to be willing to supply whatever previous quantity he was going to be willing to supply. In essence, SIG now requires a $10 higher price at every quantity in order to supply, which makes sense because he's turning around and paying $10 to the government. Which brings us to happy premise number 1. A specific tax shifts the supply curve upwards by the amount of tax per unit. Assume that this is the supply curve for Chinese food in Puerto Rico. If the government imposes a $3 per meal tax on sellers of Chinese food in Puerto Rico, the supply curve will shift upwards by $3. Assume that this is the supply curve for electric cars in Germany. If the government imposes a $1,000 tax on electric cars, the supply curve will shift upwards by $1,000. Here we have the supply and demand curve for Alaskan king crab in Dutch Harbor. Here, now this supply curve represents market supply, which is the sum of all of the supply curves of all of the fishermen like SIG in the harbor, and demand represents market demand. We can see from our diagram that currently market price is $40 and market quantity is 1,000 pounds of king crab. Now, let's impose that the government imposes a per unit tax of $10 per pound of king crab fished and sold. We know that this is going to shift every single individual supplier's supply curve upwards by $10, like SIG, which will in turn shift the entire market supply curve upwards by $10, the amount of the tax per unit. Now, at the original market price of $40, there's a shortage. Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied because suppliers are less willing to supply after the implementation of this tax. This puts upward pressure on prices until equilibrium price rises to $48 and equilibrium quantity falls to 800 pounds of crab per day. An implementation of this type of specific tax results in an increase in price and a decrease in total quantity sold. Which brings us to happy premise number 2. As long as demand is downward sloping, if we implement an indirect tax on suppliers, this will result in a higher price in the market and a lower quantity being sold. Here's a thought exercise. If demand were perfectly inelastic, that is vertical, and we implemented a tax on suppliers, shifting the supply curve up, what's going to change? Price, quantity, or both? And why? Sounds like an interesting practice AP question. You might find more of those on our website, www.evtds.com. Be sure to check it out. Okay, so who's made better off and who's made worse off as a result of imposing a tax on the market? Let's consider 3 stakeholders: the government, consumers, and producers. Before the tax, consumers purchased 1,000 pounds of crab and the price was $40 per pound. After the imposition of the tax, price increases to $48 and quantity sold decreases to $800. Consumers are clearly worse off. They're paying a higher price, they're paying $8 more per pound of crab, and they're buying less crab as well, 200 pounds less crab. Total consumer expenditures in this case decreased from $40,000, $40 per pound times 1,000 pounds, represented by this area, to 38,400 pounds, $48 times 800 pounds, represented by this area. Technically, consumer expenditure could have increased or decreased. That will depend upon price elasticity of demand. But consumers are definitely worse off. What about producers? Well, before the tax, producer revenue was $40,000. They sold 1,000 pounds at $40 each for a total of $40,000, also represented by this area. What about after the tax? Well, after the tax, they sell 800 pounds, but how much do they get per pound of crab that they sell? Well, the market price is $48, but be careful. They don't get to keep all 48 of that dollars. Remember, they have to pay the tax of $10. So producers actually only receive $38 here per pound that they sell. So producer revenue falls to $30,400. $38 times 800, or this area represented here. Producers are also worse off. They receive a lower price than they did before the tax, after paying the tax, that is, and they sell a lower quantity, decreasing their total revenue. So who benefits? Well, the government gains the revenue, right? Where is the area representing the revenue on the diagram? Well, again, the revenue is going to be represented by the total quantity that is bought and sold in the market, which is this distance here, times the tax per unit, the $10 per pound that is sold, which is this vertical distance right here. So this area right here represents the total government revenue, which is $8,000, or 800 pounds sold times $10 per pound of tax. We can also consider different stakeholders from the perspective of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus, or social surplus. Before the tax, total consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for a product and what they actually paid, is represented by the area of this triangle here, the area above price and below the demand curve. We could calculate that area as 1/2 times $40 times 1,000, or a total consumer surplus of $20,000. After the imposition of the tax, price rises to $48, quantity decreases to 800, so now consumer surplus is this smaller triangle right here, the area of which is calculated as 1/2 times 32 times 800, or 12,800. Consumer surplus falls by 7,200 as a result of the imposition of the tax. And that makes sense because consumers are buying less and they're paying a higher price. This was consumer surplus before the tax. This is consumer surplus after the tax. Total loss of consumer surplus is represented by this area here. Similarly, prior to the tax, producer surplus is calculated as this area here, the area above the supply curve and below the price that producers receive. That's 1/2 times $10 times 1,000, or a total producer surplus of $5,000. After the imposition of the tax, producers sell 800 units, but they only receive, remember, a price now of $38. So producer surplus is now this smaller triangle here, the area below the price that producers receive and above the supply curve. And total producer surplus is then calculated as $3,200. Total producer surplus falls by $1,800, and the loss of producer surplus can be seen here. This is producer surplus before the tax. This is producer surplus after the tax. This is the loss of producer surplus here. Okay, so this is the loss of producer surplus and the loss of consumer surplus as a result of the tax. But remember, the government receives tax revenue as well, so there's a benefit to somebody. Not all of this is lost. And we remember that government revenue is represented by this area here. Okay, so this is consumer surplus and producer surplus without the tax, right? So if we add them together, this would be social surplus when there is no tax. This total area here. Similarly, this is producer surplus, consumer surplus, and now government revenue added in after the tax has been implemented. Adding that all together, we can consider that to be social surplus after the tax. Social surplus before the tax, social surplus after the tax. Social surplus before the tax, social surplus after the tax. What do you see? Yeah, that thing. What happened to that thing? It's gone. This triangle here has been lost as a result of the implementation of the tax. This is what we call dead weight loss, or the loss of social surplus that arises as a result of the implementation of this type of tax. Happy premise number 3. Implementation of a specific tax on a market will result in a larger decrease in consumer and producer surplus than the increase in government revenue, which results in an overall loss of social surplus, or dead weight loss. Finally, also related to this, this is the quantity that is sold when there's no tax. And we like this quantity. Why? Because at this quantity, when there's no externalities, marginal cost, supply, equals marginal benefit. We've achieved allocative efficiency. Okay, what about after the tax is implemented? This is the quantity that is sold. When we sell this quantity, does marginal cost equal marginal benefit? No, at this quantity, marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost. There's an under allocation of resources to the production and consumption of this good. We do not achieve allocative efficiency. Okay, also important to remember. Okay, finally, you might have noticed on our fisherman example, when the government imposed a $10 tax on fishermen, as much as the fishermen would have liked to, it wasn't possible for them to pass the entire tax on to consumers. The price in the market only went up by $8. It didn't go up by the full $10. So this suggests that in this example, consumers bore $8 of the $10 tax because the price that they paid went up by $8. But producers also bore the burden of some of this tax. And where's the evidence for that? Well, after paying the tax, producers only received $38 compared to the market price of $40 before the imposition of the tax, which suggests that for every pound sold, producers wound up paying $2 of the tax. This is related to the idea of tax burden or tax incidence. In our example, consumers bore 80% of the tax burden and producers bore 20% of the tax burden. In essence, consumers are paying for 80% of the tax and producers are paying for 20% of the tax. The individual portions of tax incidence can be seen by breaking up the total government revenue into the area above the original price and below the original price in the market. So in this case, this area would represent the consumer tax incidence and this area would represent the producer tax incidence. You can see that when we change the slopes of the supply and demand curve, which is the relative price elasticity of supply and price elasticity of demand, we can then alter the tax incidence that is borne by suppliers and consumers. So there's a lot of ways to calculate it, but the easiest way to remember it is like this. If price elasticity of supply equals price elasticity of demand, meaning if supply and demand are equally elastic or equally inelastic, then producers and consumers will always bear 50% of the tax. 50%, 50%, 50%. Okay, if demand is more inelastic than supply, meaning PED is less than PES, this means that consumers will bear more of the tax burden than producers. And this should make sense. If demand is more inelastic than supply, this means that consumers are less sensitive to changes in price than producers, and they should be able to bear greater changes in price. On the other hand, if supply is more inelastic than demand, that is, if PES is less than PED, then more of the tax incidence is going to fall on suppliers, like in these cases here. Happy premise number 4, whichever side is more inelastic, supply or demand, is the side that will bear a greater proportion of the tax incidence. Okay, so today we talked about the impact of specific taxes on markets. Let's do a quick review. Number 1, specific or per unit taxes shift the supply curve upwards by the amount of the specific tax per unit. Number 2, this will result in an increase in market price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. 3, these types of taxes make consumers worse off. They wind up paying a higher price, they buy a lower quantity, and overall consumer surplus decreases. 4, producers are also made worse off by these types of taxes. They receive a lower price, generally speaking, they sell a lower quantity, and producer surplus falls as well. 5, governments are made better off because they receive government revenue from these. 6, overall society is made worse off because the loss of producer and consumer surplus is greater than the gain in government revenue, resulting in an overall loss of social surplus or deadweight loss. 7, whichever is more inelastic, supply or demand, will be the side that bears a greater proportion of the tax incidence. Okay, next time we're going to take a look at the opposite of taxes. We're going to look at subsidies, what happens to markets when governments pay businesses to make stuff. Check it out, it's going to be rad. Hey, what's going on? I hope you liked this video and it helped clarify some of the stuff you're working on in your current economics studies. If you're looking for more resources to help you with AP Economics, IB Economics, intro-level university economics, economics teaching resources, 1, go check out our website, Economics Videos That Don't Suck, evtds.com, for access to our entire catalog of economics videos, as well as practice questions, answers, and even entire mock exams. 2, be sure to subscribe to this channel, Economics Videos That Don't Suck, so you can get immediate access to all of our new videos as they're released, probably mirroring your economic studies right now.